This lecture on the book of Exodus will cover Exodus chapters 19 through 40, the covenant at Mount Sinai. The theme of this whole section, chapters 19 through 40, is covenant. The covenant is made at Sinai. Covenants establish and organize relationships. When you think of covenant, think of relationship. And this will shape Israel's relationship with God. Now, the outline of the book is as follows. Chapters 1 through 18 talked about the exodus from Egypt proper. The key word there would be deliverance. But chapters 19 through 40 talks about the covenant at Mount Sinai. And the key word here is relationship. In this part of the book, the Israelites are camped at Mount Sinai, or also called Horeb. The encampment around Sinai is the geographic context of Exodus 19 through Leviticus, actually, all the way to the middle of Numbers chapter 10. And as we said, the key word is relationship. A covenant implies a relationship. The covenant will establish a formal relationship between God and his people. And the laws of that covenant will show the people how to live within that covenant. In chapters 19 through 24, you have the covenant being offered by God and accepted by Israel. You can see the structure of this part of the book is a chiastic structure with an A, B, C, B, A type pattern. So in chapter 19, you have the covenant being offered. In chapter 20, verses 1 through 17, you have laws, the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments that are given. In 20 verses 18 through 21, you have a narrative that emphasizes fear of the Lord. And then you have laws again in Exodus 21 through 23. And then you have the narrative where the covenant is accepted in Exodus chapter 24. And notice how everything is framed. It begins with the covenant offered and ends with the covenant accepted, which suggests that covenant is the main idea of the narrative. Subordinate to covenant is law. The Ten Commandments and the Book of the Covenant are all within the rubric of covenant itself. And then at the heart of the story is fear of the Lord. It's at the heart of the chiasm because it's the attitude of heart that leads to obedience to the covenant and its law. Fear of God is the fear that one has for God that causes one to turn away from sin and obey God's commandment. And that's at the heart of the covenant. Now, the covenant was an unconditional covenant. The offer of a covenant relationship hinged on nothing that Israel had to do in order to merit a relationship. Law-keeping, in fact, follows the acceptance of the covenant relationship. In other words, it was not the case that, well, if you obey, then I'll make a covenant with you, I'll have a relationship with you. It was actually the other way around, that if you accept the covenant, well then, as a part of that covenant relationship, there's a certain way that you're supposed to live, and thus law follows the relationship. It follows the covenant being established. And only after they accept the relationship would they be obligated to keep the law. And Israel did accept it, and the obligation to obey its stipulations followed. Now, a key verse is Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you are to speak to the Israelites. two phrases here. They're to be a holy nation. They're to be a kingdom of priests. Now, what does it mean to be a holy nation? Well, a holy nation is a nation that's set apart from other nations. But it's also called a kingdom of priests. Now, they were not a kingdom of priests in the sense that all Israelites were priests, but rather corporately, the nation served a priestly function. Just as priests mediate God to non-priests, so Israel would have the responsibility of mediating God to the world. And that expression, kingdom of priests, could be paraphrased, a priestly kingdom. As a kingdom, they have a priestly role with regard to other nations. Now, this relates to Israel's election. God chose Israel not to the detriment of others, but for helping others to find God. He didn't choose Israel just to, bless them and condemn everybody else. He chose Israel that through Israel, others could also find a relationship with God. And this all goes back to the patriarchal promise found in Genesis 12 and verse 5. In your seed, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So in Abraham's seed and ultimately in Israel, all families of earth can find blessing, a promise ultimately fulfilled in Christ. Say a word about the Ten Commandments, though we're going to come back to that in a separate lecture. The Ten Commandments, also called the Decalogue, gives a summary statement of what God expects of people in covenant relationship with himself. These are minimal standards for those in relationship with God, not high moral ideas. You're not especially on a high moral ground if you don't commit murder. Even pagans can do that. Nonetheless, it does teach that God is a God of morality that expects his people to live in a moral way. The Ten Commandments can be divided up into 4 commandments pertaining to God and 6 commandments pertaining to other human beings. The commandments pertaining to God are the no other gods before me. So don't worship any God but Yahweh. No images of God, even the true God. Don't take the name of God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Those have primarily to do with one's relationship with God. But then the other ones have to do with relating to other people, honoring your parents, don't commit murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, and no coveting what belongs to your neighbor. And so they are both laws pertaining to how to relate to God and how to relate to people. Other laws in this section are the Book of the Covenant, specifically Exodus 20:22 through 23:33. And I want to illustrate that a little bit. The label Book of the Covenant comes from Exodus 24 and verse 7. These have primarily civil laws governing Israel's national life. They deal with topics covered in other ancient Near Eastern laws, such as the laws of Hammurabi. This is the head of the stela of Hammurabi in the image. Hammurabi in front of the god Shamash, which was, in their mythology, was the god of justice. But it deals with similar topics in some cases. There's parallels with laws in the Bible here and laws in these ancient Near Eastern law codes. Biblical law, however, places much more value on human life than ancient Near Eastern laws tended to do. One example of these laws are the civil laws concerning slaves. Now, how is it that one would be reduced to slavery? Well, failure to pay monetary debts is the main reason Israelites were forced into slavery. Does the Bible condone slavery? Well, when you look in detail at these slave laws, there's in fact a humanitarian purpose behind these laws. For example, the law limits involuntary slavery to 6 years. If you buy a Hebrew servant, He is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything, limiting slavery to 6 years. Now, slavery in a lot of parts of the world was for life. Once you were reduced to slavery, you were there forever, unless some relative, bought you from the slave owner. But not among the Hebrews, limited to 6 years. It's really more of a form of indentured servitude rather than strict slavery. The law makes deliberate killing of a slave murder. It says when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. And if you do a word study of the word translated avenged, it usually involves the death of the person on whom vengeance is taken. In other words, be avenged implies a death penalty on the slave owner if he deliberately kills his slave. The law also makes maiming a slave grounds for release. When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. Now you might say, this sounds a little bit unfair. Which is more valuable, an eye or a tooth? Well, both are pretty valuable. But I think all of us would agree that an eye is more valuable than a tooth. But what the law is trying to say, that be it as much as an eye or as little as a tooth, if you cause any kind of permanent damage to your slave, you must release him and give him his freedom immediately. You also have in the Ten Commandments the law that slaves are to be allowed to rest on the Sabbath day. It says there that the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. You're to allow your slave a day off on the Sabbath day. And in Deuteronomy's version of it, it says that you're to remember that you were slaves in Egypt. So there's a matter of empathy for these people that work for you. Give them at least the one day off. Now, if you were a slave and the master told you to work on the Sabbath, you'd have no choice or you'd be whipped. But the slave owners are exhorted by this law to allow them to rest on the Sabbath like everybody else. Now, the law directs former masters to give their freed slaves a fresh start. Now, here I'm jumping to Deuteronomy. If your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you for 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. And when you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, and out of your threshing floor, and out of your winepress. As the Lord your God has blessed you, you shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you, and therefore I command you this today. Now, in the last part of the book, chapters 25 through 40, you have the command that the tabernacle be built, and they're actually building of the tabernacle. The tabernacle was a movable shrine and the center of Israelite worship in the wilderness. And that's, again, the place where they would conduct the sacrifices. The tabernacle, the Hebrew word is mishkan, means a dwelling place. It was the symbolic dwelling place of God. It showed God's presence among them, his immanence in itself, of being close to them in many ways. And so the tabernacle emphasized his immanence. You also have it called the sanctuary. Not only does it symbolize God's closeness and immanence with his people, it also emphasizes his holiness and separation from his people. It was set apart by a fence and by curtains. Not everybody could enter the tabernacle, only priests and only the high priest once a year into the Holy of Holies. And so, ironically, it's both a symbol of God's presence and also a symbol of God's separation from them. And then it was also the tent of meeting. It's a place where people would go to meet God. After the glory of God filled the tabernacle in Exodus 40, God's presence was there, and therefore it became a place of prayer and meeting with God. What was the purpose of the tabernacle? Again, it's a symbol of the holiness of God. It was a symbol of the presence of God, a movable shrine representing God's presence among them. You might say it was the living extension of Mount Sinai, the symbol of the covenant relationship. They left Sinai, but they brought this symbol of the living extension of Sinai in the tabernacle. Again, it was a place to where prayer was directed. Exodus 25 and verse 8. Let them build for me a sanctuary so that I may dwell among them. Symbol of the presence of God. And it was the place of sacrifice and worship. Animal sacrifice was at the heart of Israelite worship. Leviticus 1 through 7 elaborates on that. And the tabernacle's bronze altar was where those sacrifices would be offered. Again, this is a schema of the tabernacle. It gives the measurements in cubits. The holy place was 10 by 20 by 10. The Holy of Holies was 10 by 10 cubits. A cubit is like 1.5 feet. 20 cubits would be like 30 feet. And so this was a relatively small structure. And in the middle of the tabernacle was the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. And this was where the actual presence of God was. If you were a priest, you would mostly work on the outside with the bronze altar and wash your hands at the bronze laver. But then you would go in to offer the blood before the presence of God in the holy place. But then only once a year the high priest would go where the Ark of the Covenant was, in the Holy of Holies. A little bit more about the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was a box of wood covered with gold with angelic cherubim statues on top of it. It, as described in Exodus 25, 10 through 22. It symbolizes the throne of God, or his footstool on earth. It was the only piece of furniture in the Holy of Holies, and it was the most sacred object in Israel's religion. The Ark of the Covenant was the throne of God. Psalm 80 and verse 1, you are enthroned above the cherubim, shine forth. Psalm 99 and verse 1, the Lord reigns, let the people tremble. He sits enthroned above the cherubim, let the earth quake. And also 1 Samuel 4:4, the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned above the cherubim. The Ark represents the throne of God, or perhaps the footstool of his heavenly throne on earth. And so it uses this language of enthronement pertaining to the Ark of the Covenant and the cherubim that are on top of it. Now, in the Ark of the Covenant, there were 3 objects that were stored. One was the 10 Commandments. Deuteronomy 10 verses 1 through 5 talks about this. The 10 Commandments, the Decalogue, were a symbol of God's covenant relationship with his people. They also put inside of it a pot of manna. In Exodus 16, 31 through 35, they were told to put some manna in the ark as a reminder of how God provided for them manna in the wilderness. And then later in Numbers chapter 17, Aaron's rod, which blossomed, was put inside the ark. That rod had been a symbol and sign to the rebellious of that time. Now, the top of the ark is known as the mercy seat, at least in King James. Exodus 25 and verse 17. It's rendered mercy seat in King James Version. It's better rendered atonement cover in the NIV. The Hebrew word is kaporet, related to Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. It was a place where atonement blood was sprinkled on the Day of Atonement, and was thus the place of atonement, where the blood met the presence of God and forgiveness of sin could occur. So, a very important part of the ark, the atonement cover, the mercy seat. In between the account of the commands to build the tabernacle and the actual building of the tabernacle comes the golden calf incident of Exodus 32 through 34. At this point, the covenant was violated. When Moses lingered on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights in Exodus 24 and verse 18, the Israelites grew tired of waiting and assumed the worst. They requested that Aaron make a golden bowl out of their earrings, and the people then broke out into a drunken reverie, chapter 32 and verse 6. And when Moses came down to see what they had done from Mount Sinai, he broke the tablets of the Ten Commandments, symbolizing the breaking of the covenant, and he went on to destroy the golden calf. God threatened even to destroy Israel, but Moses intervened in an intercessory prayer which prevented Yahweh from wiping Israel out completely. Read about that in Exodus 32, verses 9 through 14. And note the tension between God's mercy and God's holiness seen here and throughout the Bible. On the one hand, he's merciful, but on the other hand, he's holy. And how can he be both at the same time? Now, after this incident, Moses is allowed to see the after parts of God. Exodus chapter 33 and 34. Moses enjoyed a remarkably close relationship with God. God spoke to Moses face to face, 33 and verse 11. Though not literally, no one can see God face to face and live, but he saw something of God's presence. Moses asked to see God's glory. God responded that Moses cannot see God's face, for no one can do that and live, 33, 19 through 20, but he could see God's after parts, or back, 33, 21 through 23. And the fulfillment of that is in chapter 34, where God proclaimed his ethical attributes. He said before Moses, Yahweh, Yahweh is compassionately gracious, slow to anger and abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. And yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. That's chapter 34, verses 6 and 7. Now here it seems that God's afterparts seem to be his ethical character. Moses did not see God, but he was allowed to learn of his character. And note again this tension between God's holiness and God's mercy. God is merciful, compassionately gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving iniquity, wickedness, rebellion, and sin. He forgives sin of every kind and degree. And yet, he remains holy, does not leave the guilty unpunished. There's always that tension between God's holiness and God's mercy. Well, when Moses sees the afterparts of God and returns from his encounter with Yahweh, his face was radiant. Exodus 34, 29 through 35. And I think it's true of us as well, that our faces reflect the glory of God as we meet with him face to face in Scripture. Well, the tabernacle is completed in chapter 40, and that's when God comes upon the structure and begins to dwell in it. In chapter 40, verse 34, when the cloud covered the tent of meeting and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, Moses could not enter the tent of the meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, wherever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. And so the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, and in the sight of all the house of Israel during all their travels. And so the book of Exodus ends with God's glory filling the tabernacle, making it ready for use in the rituals, as we'll see in the book of Leviticus. Well, anyway, that's a brief survey of Exodus chapters 19 through chapters 40, and is where we get the account of God's making of his covenant with Israel in the days of Moses.